I'll be honest from the start. The man I fell in love with has never once touched alcohol. Not because of some lofty moral code, but because for him, the smell itself is like a fire alarm, shrill, sharp, and impossible to ignore. If you've ever listened to Missreddit, you'll know how the smallest detail can become the red flag that turns a love story into a cautionary tale. And before we dive in, if you crave real drama based on real lives told in a raw, emotional voice like mine, make sure to subscribe to Missreddit. You don't want to miss stories like this. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. I met Michael at a mid-sized firm in downtown Cleveland, where the coffee machine broke down more often than the printers. He was a few years older, working in administration, the kind of person younger staff went to whenever the system crashed or HR drowned us in forms. He showed me shortcuts through endless paperwork, explained things patiently without ever talking down to me. His kindness was quiet, almost invisible, like the warm coat you only notice when the wind hits hard off Lake Erie. It started with coffee break conversations, then after-work walks, then meals that were clumsy but delicious because we made them together. I liked filling our apartment with music. He liked the silence in between. I moved fast and burned out quickly. He moved slow and steady, always catching me before I tripped. One night, he handed me a spare key. "Come home," he said simply. That was how we became a we. Our little Cleveland apartment was stitched together by rituals, Friday takeout, Sunday pancakes, and monthly weekend escapes into Pennsylvania. When he got home first, he cooked when I had time. I folded laundry. Friends called us seamless. And then there was his refusal to drink. At every party, when the beers made their rounds, he smiled and shook his head. I've been boxing since I was a kid. My body can't handle it. Honestly, I hate the smell. No drama, no judgment. To me, it was discipline, self-control, proof of the steady character I admired. I didn't yet realize that "I don't drink" was 6 words hiding a story that could crack open everything I thought I knew about him. As time passed, our relationship rolled naturally toward marriage. My parents, Patricia and George, adored Michael the moment he walked into their home. My mother cooked a feast roast chicken, mashed potatoes, her famous apple pie. My father poured drinks, welcomed Michael as if he were already family. Conversation flowed easily until my mother, casually, warmly, asked, "So, Michael, tell us about your family." For a fraction of a second, I saw it. His smile slipped. His eyes dimmed. Then he recovered, smooth and quick. "Oh, they're in another part of Ohio. Nothing much to say. We don't see each other often." And before anyone could press, he steered the talk toward my father's logistics job, as if nothing had happened. But I noticed. That night, driving home, with the wipers clicking against the windshield, I realized there was a locked room. In Michael's life I had never entered. I told myself not to pry. Love, I thought, would open the door in its own time. Still, for the first time, I wonder if I truly knew the man I planned to marry. Soon after, wedding talk filled every corner of my parents' house. My mother dreamed of flowers lining an aisle. My father pretended indifference, but smiled when she mentioned the first dance. For them, marriage was celebration, tradition, family. Michael, though, had other ideas. Over takeout one night, he said softly, "What if we just keep it small? Courthouse, dinner, a few close friends. No big reception." His reasoning was practical, even romantic. Why spend money feeding 100 strangers when we could save for a house? But when I repeated this to my parents, my mother slammed down her fork. "No reception? Absolutely not. You deserve a real wedding. We'll pay if we have to." My father nodded, firm. I was caught between them, between tradition and pragmatism, between the sparkle in my mother's eyes and the steady logic in Michael's voice. Later, folding laundry together, I brought it up gently. That was when Michael froze, a T-shirt in his hands, and said words that unsettled me more than I expected. "My parents won't be there." I stared. Why not? They just won't. His tone cut off the conversation like a slammed door. And for the first time, I realized love alone might not be enough to silence the questions pounding in my chest. Secrets, I've learned, are not loud. They whisper. They sit quietly in the corner of a room while you fold laundry, waiting for the right moment to unsettle you. Michael's avoidance of family talk wasn't new, but now it had weight. Every time I mentioned the wedding, he brushed it aside, insisting a big celebration was unnecessary. My parents, on the other hand, insisted just as strongly that I deserved the full ritual. I felt like rope in a tug of war, stretched thin between two forces that refused to yield. One night, as we cleared the dinner table, I tried again. They really want a bigger wedding, Michael. They'll even pay for it. His hands stilled. The silence lasted long enough for me to feel the air shift between us. Then he said quietly, "Emily, they won't come. My parents won't be there. That's just how it is." I wanted to believe him, to let the matter drop. But his tone flat. Final left me with more questions than answers. What kind of parents refused to attend their only son's wedding? Was it anger? Estrangement? Something darker? He offered no details. Just silence. In moments like that, I thought of all the posts. I had read online threads on Reddit about partners who hid parts of themselves, about weddings overshadowed by family drama, about the way secrets seeped into marriages like cracks in concrete. I had always pitied those strangers. Now I felt like one of them. Still, I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe his family was private. Maybe they had their reasons. Maybe. But deep down, the questions refused to die. That was when Michael mentioned he had a short business trip. He packed an overnight bag, kissed me on the forehead, and left before dawn. I stood at the window, watching the cab disappear, my heart racing not because I missed him already, but because I had made a decision. That evening, cleaning out his car, I found what I hadn't even known I was searching for, a folded envelope addressed to Carol Harris, Youngstown, Ohio. The name hit me like a blow. He had said Carol once, quickly, as if by accident, then never again. And here it was, written in neat, unmistakable handwriting. My hands shook as I slipped the envelope into my purse. I told myself I shouldn't cross that line, but curiosity and fear had already done it for me. The next morning, I set my GPS for Youngstown. The highway stretched long and gray, carrying me away from the safety of Cleveland and into the heart of the Rust Belt. Abandoned warehouses, broken windows, sagging houses. The further I drove, the heavier the air became, and with every mile, I understood something new. Whatever Michael was hiding, it wasn't just family tension. It was a past steeped in shadows, the kind that clings like smoke long after the fire has gone out. The morning Michael left for his business trip, the sky was still ink dark. He kissed my forehead, told me to eat breakfast, and carried his overnight bag out the door. I stood at the window until the cab disappeared, my hand resting on the glass. I had already made up my mind. The envelope in my purse, Carol. Harris, Youngstown. Ohio was like a stone burning a hole through fabric. His secret had a name, and I couldn't pretend I didn't see it. So I packed a small bag, told my parents I had errands outside the city, and set the GPS. 2 hours, the screen said. Just 2 hours between the life I knew and the life he refused to talk about. The highway stretched flat and gray. As Cleveland's skyline shrank in the mirror, the world turned quieter, heavier. Abandoned warehouses with shattered glass. Rusted water towers leaning like tired giants, graffiti fading under years of acid rain. I rolled past liquor stores with flickering neon, diners slumped beneath sagging awnings, children's bikes rusting in yards where grass had long since died. By the time I reached Youngstown, the silence felt almost alive. It clung to the house's porches caving in, curtains stained yellow, fences leaning like broken ribs. The GPS announced the street, the number painted crookedly on a cracked mailbox, Harris. My stomach knotted. The house sagged under its own weight. Beer cans littered the porch. Windows sealed with grime. The air smelled of stale alcohol even before I stepped onto the creaking steps. I knocked. Once, twice. A voice barked from inside, rough, irritated. The door creaked open, and she stood there, Carol Harris. Her hair was matted, her eyes rimmed red. A bathrobe clung to her frame, stained with liquor and food. A cheap vodka bottle dangled from her hand. She squinted at me, suspicion sharp even through her haze. What if you're from the electric company? I told you I don't care. Shut it off. Her words slurred. My throat dried. I'm looking for Carol Harris. You found her. Who the hell are you? Before I could answer, a younger voice called out from the back of the house. Mom, stop. She's not the power company. And then she appeared. A girl, maybe 12, thin frame, messy ponytail. Eyes the same piercing green I'd seen flicker in Michael's when he laughed. Her name, I would learn soon enough, was Lily. But in that moment, all I knew was this. Michael's silence wasn't just about shame. It was about survival. And standing on that porch, face to face with the wreckage of the family he had left behind, I realized I was about to uncover more than I was ready for. Because the truth doesn't whisper here. In this house, it screams. Lily didn't run at first. She just stared at me, arms crossed, daring me to say why I was standing there. Behind her, Carol swayed with the vodka bottle, muttering curses under her breath. Then, without warning, Lily bolted. The screen door slammed shut behind her as she disappeared down the street. My instinct took over. I chased her, gravel crunching under my boots, my heart pounding harder than my breath. Lily, wait! She didn't. She slipped between two leaning houses and darted down a dirt path until the world opened up into a clearing by the water. An old convenience store sagged on the corner, its sign half burned out, and beyond it a narrow trail curved toward a lake. By the time I caught up, she was sitting on a fallen log near the shoreline, her knees pulled to her chest, her hair tangled in the wind. I stopped, trying not to spook her. Then I held up a small bag I'd grabbed from the store along the way. I thought maybe you'd want something to eat. Cookies, jerky, lollipops, cheap, but something. Her green eyes narrowed with suspicion. For a moment, I thought she'd spit on the ground and tell me to get lost. Instead, she reached out, snatched a cookie, and bit down hard, chewing like she was proving a point. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of water lapping against the rocks. I didn't push. Finally, her voice cut the air sharp but quiet. You're not from around here. Why'd you come? The truth pressed against my chest. I know your brother, Michael. Her head snapped up. Those eyes widened, then narrowed again, fierce and raw. You're lying. I'm not, I said quickly. I'm engaged to him. We're supposed to get married. Her shoulders sank. A humorless laugh slipped from her lips. So that's why he showed up. She looked away, toward the water. He doesn't talk about us, does he? I shook my head. No, he never has. That's why I came. I wanted to understand. She picked at the lollipop wrapper, her fingers, trembling though her voice stayed steady. There were four of us. Sarah, the oldest, she got married young. Michael, then Daniel, then me. The way she said Daniel's name, like it was both a wound and a prayer, made my skin prickle. Michael used to come home a lot. She continued. He tried, brought food, clothes. He yelled at Mom to stop drinking, but she never did. And Daniel, her voice cracked. She pulled her knees tighter. Daniel stayed. He thought he could save her. I waited. My heart thudded, heavy with the sense that what came next would be the truth Michael had built his silence around. One winter night, Lily whispered, Mom's boyfriend came at her with a knife. Daniel stepped in, tried to stop him. She stopped, staring hard at the lake. He didn't make it. The words shattered the air. I covered my mouth. Horrified, her voice hardened. Michael wasn't here. Snowstorm kept him stuck in Cleveland. He blames himself. Thinks if he'd been there, Daniel would still be alive. That's why he doesn't drink. That's why he doesn't come back. He hates her. He hates this house. And he hates himself for leaving us. Her eyes met mine, then green, fierce, breaking. And now, you know. I swallowed hard, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. The silence I'd always felt in Michael wasn't pride. It wasn't mystery. It was grief. Grief so deep it built walls around him. Walls I had mistaken for discipline, for control. And sitting there beside Lily, I realized this was only the beginning. The drive back to Cleveland felt endless. The same road, the same rusted factories, the same flat horizon, but everything looked different now. My hands tightened on the wheel as Lily's words replayed in my head like a broken record. He blames himself. He hates himself for leaving us. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of our apartment building, my chest was heavy with the weight of a truth I couldn't carry alone. That evening, when Michael came home from his trip, he kissed me lightly, asked about my day, started unpacking his bag. I watched him move around the apartment steady, careful, predictable. The man who made pancakes on Sundays and folded laundry without complaint. And yet, behind all that, I could see the shadows. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Michael, I said softly, sitting at the kitchen table. I need to tell you something. He paused, his back to me. What is it? My throat tightened. I went to Youngstown. The air cracked. He turned slowly, his face pale, eyes wide. You what? His voice was low, sharp, a mixture of shock and panic. I found your mother's house. I continued, my words tumbling out before I could stop them. I met Lily. At her name, he flinched like I'd struck him. His hands trembled as he set his bag down, staring at me as though the floor had just vanished beneath him. You shouldn't have gone there, he whispered, his voice breaking. You don't understand what that place is. You don't know what she's been through. What I've been trying to protect you from. I reached across the table, but he pulled back as though my touch burned. His breath came fast, ragged, his jaw clenched. Michael, I do understand, I said firmly, my own voice steady against his storm. I saw Carol. I saw the house. And I spoke to Lily. She's just a child. She needs you. She needs to know she's not forgotten. His eyes filled with panic. Then pain. You don't get it. Emily, I swore I would never drag anyone into that hell. I built this life to escape it. I've spent years keeping the past away. I can't let it poison you too. I swallowed hard, fighting the tears rising in my chest. She told me about Daniel. His body went rigid. His lips parted, but no sound came out. For a moment, all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator and the pounding of my own heartbeat. Finally, he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, his voice hoarse. I should have been there if I hadn't stayed in Cleveland that weekend. If I had pushed through the storm, Daniel would still be alive. He wouldn't have had to fight alone. I failed him. Emily, I failed my brother. Tears blurred my vision, but I forced my words out. No, it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have stopped that night. No one could. You didn't fail him, you were a kid yourself. You've carried this guilt for years, but it doesn't belong to you. He shook his head violently, his breath breaking. You don't know what it's like to live with that picture in your head. The blood, the screaming. My mother too drunk to even realize what had happened until it was too late. I told myself I'd never go back, that I'd cut it off forever. It's the only way I survived. I reached across the table again, this time placing my hand firmly over his clenched fists. Survival isn't enough. Michael, Lily is still there. She loves you, and whether you like it or not, she is part of your life, part of our life. When we get married, I want her there. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because she is your family, our family. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes red and raw. You really mean that? I do, I whispered, tears sliding down my cheeks. We can't change the past, but we can change the future for her, for us, for Daniel's memory. Don't you think he would want that? Michael's whole body trembled. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded, his voice barely audible. Yes, he would. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with secrets. For the first time, Michael allowed his pain to be seen, and I steady, unflinching held it with him. That night, our wedding stopped being about parties or traditions. It became something else entirely. Redemption. It wasn't the kind of wedding little girls dream about. No grand aisle, no chandeliers, no endless rows of smiling guests. Just sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the Mahoning County Courthouse. I wore a simple cream dress, hem brushing my knees. Michael stood beside me in a navy suit, his hands trembling slightly, his jaw tense. His eyes, though when they looked at me, were steady. The judge's words were brief, perfunctory, but every syllable echoed like a vow etched in stone. Do you take? Do you promise? I do, to signatures on paper, to hands clasped tighter than ever before. That was it. Husband and wife. Behind us, my parents clapped softly. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue. My father cleared his throat, pretending not to be emotional. Two of Michael's closest friends from work had come as witnesses, smiling with quiet pride. But the moment that cracked something open in my chest was when Lily stepped forward. She wore a borrowed floral dress and sandals I had bought her the week before. They hung a little loose on her frame, but in that moment she looked radiant, shy, small, but glowing with something fierce. You look beautiful, she whispered, her voice fragile but true. Then she threw her arms around her brother. Michael bent down, holding her so tightly I thought he'd never let go. His face was buried in her hair, and for the first time, I saw him not as the man who carried guilt like a second skin, but as a brother reclaiming a piece of himself he thought was lost forever. We walked out of the courthouse together, three shadows in the spring light. No limos, no champagne, just us. And instead of a ballroom reception, we took everyone to a small diner down the street. Chrome stools, vinyl booths, the smell of bacon and coffee lingering in the air. We filled a corner booth with laughter, plates of pancakes, omelets, and burgers. My best friend snapped photos on her phone. They weren't staged portraits. They were messy, real, alive. Michael cutting a slice of pie while Lily grinned beside him. My mother teaching Lily how to stir cream into her coffee. My father leaning back with a rare, contented smile. Halfway through the meal, the waitress caught on that it was a wedding celebration. She returned with a slice of chocolate pie, congratulations written across it in syrup. She refused to take payment. The table erupted in cheers as Michael and I shared a forkful. It wasn't champagne in crystal glasses, but it was sweeter than anything I had ever imagined. When the plates were cleared and coats gathered, Michael pulled me aside. He held a small envelope, documents tucked neatly inside. His voice was low, but steady. I already talked to a lawyer. He said, I want to start the process of becoming Lily's guardian. CPS will need to evaluate. There will be hearings, but I can't leave her in that house any longer. Tears blurred my vision. I cupped his cheek, smiling through the weight of everything we'd just survived. Then we'll do it together. She's ours now, our family, outside. The afternoon sun painted the street in gold. Michael, Lily, and I walked side by side, her small hands clutching both of ours as if afraid to let go. For years, Michael had thought family meant pain, chaos, and loss. But now, standing between his sister and his wife, he finally felt something new, hope. If a wedding felt like redemption, then what came next felt like trial by fire. Becoming Lily's guardian wasn't as simple as signing papers. It was lawyers, judges, social workers, endless questions that cut deeper than I expected. CPS sent caseworkers to our apartment, clipboards in hand, scanning every corner as though the shadows themselves might betray us. They opened cupboards, checked smoke alarms, measured bedrooms. They asked Michael about his income, my job, our relationship. They asked Lily about school, about safety, about whether she felt at home. Every answer mattered. Every detail was a test. Michael took it, all with a steady face. But at night, when the apartment finally went quiet, I'd see him sit on the edge of the bed, rubbing his temples like the weight of the world was pressing down. It feels like they're measuring every inch of me, he admitted one night, like they're waiting for me to fail. They're not, I whispered, resting my head on his shoulder. They just want to know she's safe. And she is. Because of you. Still, I couldn't ignore the truth behind his fear. Families like his rarely got second chances. In places like Youngstown's Rust Belt, poverty and addiction were cycles that swallowed generations whole. The statistics were brutal. Children shuffled through foster care. Parents losing rights not because they didn't love their kids, but because they couldn't outrun their demons. And Carol Michael's mother wasn't even trying. When the first hearing came, the courtroom smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. The judge reviewed Michael's record, clean, steady employment. No criminal history. My parents submitted letters of support. Michael's coworkers vouched for his character. Carol never showed. Not once. The judge noted her absence, her history, her inability to provide. Then he looked at Michael, eyes softened just slightly. You've taken responsibility when no one else has. That matters here. By the end of the summer, the ruling was clear. Michael Harris was granted full legal guardianship of Lily Harris. Outside the courthouse, Lily clutched the official papers in her small hands like they were a shield. Her eyes shimmered, a mixture of disbelief and relief. Michael bent down, his voice breaking as he whispered into her hair. You're with us now, for good. No one can take that away. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing quietly, while I stood beside them with tears streaming freely down my cheeks. That moment wasn't just legal victory. It was survival rewritten. For Michael, it was proof he could break the cycle. For Lily, it was proof she wasn't invisible. And for me, it was proof that family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes, it's the one you choose to fight for. The apartment had always been quiet, predictable. To toothbrushes in the bathroom, to mugs by the sink, to sets of shoes by the door. But the day Lily moved in, everything changed. Her laughter echoed down the hallway like it had been waiting years for somewhere safe to land. Her textbooks spread across the kitchen table, pages marked with doodles and half-finished homework. Her rollerblades clattered across the hardwood floors until the neighbors knocked on the wall, and we all burst out laughing. At first, she moved cautiously, like a guest afraid to overstay her welcome. She folded blankets too neatly, tiptoed when she opened the fridge, apologized when she left crumbs on the counter. It broke my heart because a 12-year-old shouldn't act like a tenant asking permission to exist. So we made new rituals. I helped her with homework after dinner, while Michael showed her how to throw a proper punch at the boxing gym. Friday nights, we rented movies and let her pick, even when it meant back-to-back teen comedies. Sunday mornings, she joined our pancake tradition, splattering batter everywhere until the kitchen looked like a war zone. Slowly, the haunted look in her eyes softened. She began leaving her jacket tossed carelessly on the couch, claiming her corner of the living room with stuffed animals and library books. She started humming to herself in the shower. She began to believe she belonged, but healing isn't linear. One night, while Michael and I were cleaning up, a shouting match erupted in the apartment next door. The sound of a man's voice raised in anger. The slam of a door. Lily froze, the plate in her hands clattering to the floor. Her breathing quickened, her eyes wild. Michael rushed to her, but she flinched when he touched her shoulder. I can't, she stammered, tears flooding. He knelt down in front of her, his voice breaking. Lily, you're safe. He's not here. He can't hurt you. But I could see it, the flashback pulling her back into that night in Youngstown, the knife, the shouting, the blood. Michael pulled her into his arms, rocking her gently, whispering the same words over and over. "You're safe. You're safe. You're safe." It was the first time I saw him confront the past head-on, not by burying it, but by holding her through it. Later that night, after Lily had finally fallen asleep, Michael sat beside me on the couch, his head in his hands. "This is why I didn't want her here," he admitted, voice raw. "Because she deserves peace, and I don't know if I can give it to her." I took his hand, squeezed it tight. "You already are. Peace isn't about silence. It's about showing her she's not alone." He looked at me then, eyes tired but full of something new, a determination I hadn't seen before. Our apartment wasn't quiet anymore. It was messy, loud, complicated, but for the first time, it felt like home for all three of us. It was Michael's idea. One gray November morning, he stood in the kitchen, hands twisting together nervously, and said, "I want to take you both to see Daniel." The words hung heavy in the air. Lily froze mid-bite of cereal, her spoon clinking softly against the bowl. My chest tightened. We drove back toward Youngstown, the air crisp with early winter. None of us spoke much during the ride. The silence wasn't empty, it was thick, filled with memories none of us had lived together, but all of us carried. The cemetery lay on a low hill outside of town. The trees were bare, their branches clawing at the sky. Brown leaves crunched underfoot as we walked. Michael held a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, their petals trembling in the wind. When we found the headstone, his steps slowed, then stopped. Daniel Harris, beloved son and brother. Michael dropped to his knees. His shoulders shook as he placed the flowers against the cold stone. His voice cracked, hoarse and raw. "I'm sorry. I should have been here. I should have protected you." The words tore from him like they had been waiting years to be freed. His hands pressed against the granite, his tears falling hot onto the frost. I knelt beside him, wrapping my arms around his back, whispering through my own tears, "You didn't fail him. You've carried this guilt for too long. Daniel wouldn't want you to live this way." Beside us, Lily stood stiff, her small fists clenched, her lips pressed tight. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed a hand on her brother's shoulder. Her voice wavered but didn't break. "You didn't fail him, Michael. You saved me. You saved me when he couldn't." Michael turned, pulling her into his arms. The two of them clung to each other, grief spilling out in broken sobs. I held them both, feeling the weight of the past pressing down, and then, finally, lifting just enough to let us breathe. Snowflakes began to fall soft, delicate. The first of the season. They landed on Michael's hair, on Lily's trembling shoulders, on Daniel's grave. The world grew. Quiet, blanketed in a hush that felt almost holy. Michael closed his eyes, inhaled the cold air, and whispered words I never thought I'd hear. "I forgive myself." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't grand. But it was real. And in that fragile moment, surrounded by snow and silence, Michael let go of a weight that had chained him for years. We walked back to the car together, Michael holding my hand in one, Lily's in the other. Three shadows against the falling snow. A family not defined by what we had lost, but by what we had chosen to build. For the first time, hope felt permanent. Life after the cemetery felt different. Not easier, not lighter overnight, but different. As if Michael had set down a burden heavy enough to let him finally stand tall. Our apartment shifted again, slowly weaving Lily into its fabric. Her laughter wasn't hesitant anymore. It spilled freely through the rooms. She stuck photos to the fridge, snapshots from our diner reception, goofy Polaroids from the mall photo booth, her rollerblades propped proudly by the door. We built routines, messy but real. Dinner together every night, even if it was just pizza. Homework sprawled across the coffee table. Saturdays at the boxing gym, where Michael taught her to punch the bag with precision, not rage. Sundays at the library, where she tore through books faster than we could keep up. Of course, there were hard days, nights when Lily woke from nightmares, shaking and crying. calling Daniel's name, days when Michael withdrew, staring at nothing, replaying memories he still hadn't forgiven himself for. But now, instead of silence, we talked. Instead of walls, we reached for each other. Therapy became part of our life. Lily sat with a counselor, learning that survival didn't mean silence. Michael joined a support group for adult children of alcoholics, admitting things he'd never spoken aloud before. I sat in sessions too, learning how to love people who carried scars I couldn't erase. Through it all, we held onto one truth. Family wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. One evening, months later, I came home to find Michael helping Lily with a school project. A poster board covered in cutout pictures and bold letters. My hero. She had glued a photo of him in the center. Michael's voice cracked when he asked, "Why me?" Lily shrugged like it was obvious. "Because you didn't forget me. You came back." He pulled her into his arms, tears spilling down his cheeks. And I stood in the doorway, realizing this was the ending we had all been fighting toward. Not a perfect ending, but a real one. On our living room wall, we framed 3 things side by side. A picture from our courthouse wedding, Lily's first report card with all passing grades, and a photo of the 3 of us at Daniel's grave, snow falling around us. A reminder of where we had been and how far we had come. The silence that once unsettled me was gone. In its place was laughter, arguments over TV shows, the clatter of dishes, the sound of healing. And I understood something I had never fully known before. Love isn't just sharing joy. It's shouldering grief, rewriting stories, refusing to let the past dictate the future. Michael thought family meant chaos. Lily thought family meant abandonment. I thought family meant tradition. We were all wrong. Family, I learned, is the people who stand beside you when the storm hits and stay until the sun comes back. And as the 3 of us walked hand in hand down the crowded streets of Cleveland, one spring afternoon, sunlight warm on our faces, I finally felt it in my bones. This was home. This was family.